Welcome to my February 11th, 2025 webinar on how to recognize tangles. The last 2 months, last two webinars, I've been talking about tangles, energetic tangles that result from the conflict of feelings, emotions, and desires, needs that are existent within us, and it can apply to any topic. And typically, when we experience a tangle, we feel that we're stuck. We can't make a decision. We can't move forward. We're not clear about what to do. Um, we would like to be doing one thing, but we find that we're doing something else, like procrastinating, basically. Um, and so we go through these kinds of situations, and no matter what we do, it keeps happening. It just keeps happening over and over again. And so we remain stuck in a certain pattern. And these are very, very difficult to change. And you can work on it in counseling and life support, and that sort of, life coaching kind of things. But basically, you're stuck in that kind of situation. So again, this month we're going to talk about untangling, and it's going to be based on a book which I've cited many times called Untangling: How You Can Transform What's Impossibly Stuck. Hey, it's working, I think, pretty well. There we go. It's by Barbara McGavin and Ann Weiser Cornell. Um, and in this book, they describe what tangles are and how they arise and how to get out of them. And I strongly recommend the book. I know some of you actually obtained copies, either the audio version or a print version. And, I've been going through the book and hopefully getting a lot out of it. So in this month's webinar, we're going to look deeply into just what tangles look like in our lives so that we can recognize them. Um, hate to use the word dissect, but I'm a doctor, to see what the components of the tangles are and then take steps to dissipate the energy that's bound up in those tangles, resolve the conflict, and result in a happy outcome. Um, when we're in a tangle, feeling confused and whatever, we tend to come up with an explanation of why we're stuck, a story about our life that sort of makes sense. And unfortunately, the more we're in a story, well, that usually just doesn't bring us resolution to our situation. The more we're in the story, it's like the more firmly we're stuck in our tangle. And so, we keep telling ourselves, well, it's like this because of this, that, and the other thing. I'm not financially successful because these are hard economic times and there's a lot of competition. And maybe I don't have all the training I might, benefit from uh, for my career and that sort of thing. And so we come up with a story about why we're where we are and not really getting into the issues of, well, I'm afraid that if I tried and failed, I'd feel really badly, those kind of things. So that's one of the reasons we get stuck. So we're going to learn how to recognize those symptoms and be able to deal with them. And so Barbara McGavin and Ann Weiser Cornell in their book describe 6 ways in which these kinds of situations arise in us, what they look like, what they feel like. Um, there are also archetypes that are presented by Carolyn Mace, which many of them deal with this kind of issue. And then there are what are known as dosha, which are the fundamental operating principles from Ayurveda that also describe situations that can lead to our not feeling fulfilled, not being able to be productive, and to, engage in activity in a natural and spontaneous and successful way. Now, the key to getting unstuck is seeing our tangles from a special perspective. That is, from a state of presence. I always use the word state to describe presence. Presence isn't a thing, it's a style of functioning in our awareness that allows us to be objective, to look at things as they happen without being attached to them, attached to particular modes of functioning within our physiology. In the state of presence, we witness the different feelings and beliefs that comprise the energy tangle from a neutral place. And this is really key, where we observe what's going on within us within a neutral place without judgment, without fear, and maybe most particularly without criticism, right? Without pouncing on us ourselves. Fortunately, we can use language to help us find ourself in presence. That is, ourself, who we are, being present with what's going on inside us. Knowing how tangles manifest within us helps us to identify the components of our tangles, which is a big step toward untangling. That is, knowing what the different components are. In this book, and that, by the way, is not a matter of insight. That's not what helps us. It's that just knowing the different components allows us to be present with them so that we can allow the energy that's contained within them to dissipate. And as I said, McGavin and Cornell describe 6 ways that tangles manifest. So let's go through those with detail. I'm going to move this right along. Let's go through these things in detail, along with the 4 principal archetypes and 3 dosha. Combining these gives us a powerful tool for recognizing and working with our tangles, which we will try out in our group clearing session. We're going to actually work with our tangles, and hence that homework that I gave you to write out a description of your tangles as best you can. So 6 types of tangles described by Barbara McGavin and Ann Weiser Cornell. The first one is hijack. And I got to make a comment about these 6. They're not scientific classifications and distinct units. If I was writing this out, I would write them much more precisely and much more technically. Barbara McGavin and Ann Weiser Cornell have a kind of just description. And fundamentally, all tangles turn out to be hijacks. But hijack for them has a particular word and a particular meaning, and they want to explain that. A part that wants something takes over, and they use the description as though it stole the car keys, climbed into the driver's seat, and went for a joyride, doing things repetitively and unable to stop, and hence producing addictive behaviors. This notion that they stole the car keys, it's a beautiful way of putting it, climbed into the driver's seat and went for a joyride. They took control. They hijacked a situation, took control, and made things go a certain way. And they do that repeatedly over and over and over again. So that example that I gave for the homework of needing to go to bed, but frequently diverting myself into simple pleasures of watching YouTube videos and such, that's the hijack. That's the hijack part of it. And in these other of the 6 types, hijacking is still taking place. So it's the basic way things operate within us. And I like that analogy again, that we stole the car keys. The fact that we took control, we shouldn't have. There's something wrong in that. But some part takes control and guides us into behaviors that are some other part of us doesn't want. Now, a second part is called a takeover. It's a childlike part that tries to take on an adult role, take responsibility, and it tends to be very anxious and hold things very rigidly in a black and white sort of way. It's controlled through predictions of doom. It's always telling you, if you don't do this, if you don't act a certain way, you're doomed, you're going to suffer. It's going to be very painful for you. And this becomes central and takes over emotions and actions. The controlled part may rebel and it may collaborate with other parts that agree on the problem. But the part that wants to take over takes on responsibility. It thinks it's right. It thinks it knows how you are supposed to be. And it works very hard to get you to be that way, even though other parts may resist. And that brings on a rebellion. Parts go on strike. You just don't do what needs to be done is an action block. So in a rebellion, there is often an action block. You can't do what you're supposed to do. Maybe you're trying to write or do some other project and you just can't get it done. And I had an interesting experience today where I needed my son-in-law to help me, and he came over to pick up my granddaughter. I was babysitting, and I asked him if he would help, and he's a wonderful guy, always says yes if he possibly can. And so we went down to the basement, undertook a project of changing the filters in the water filter, and he figured out how to do it, why I wasn't successful, and he took the thing apart very quickly, and we changed the filters and did everything that needed to be done. And afterward, I felt so good that this project that I'd wanted to do and just somehow hadn't gotten done finally got done. It's months overdue, and now I feel really good because I got clean filters in my system. Um, so anyway, parts go on strike. The fourth one is the inner critics, intimidation. They're driven by anxiety, powerlessness, loneliness, a sense of isolation, and can sound desperate, angry, negative, and mean. And also unappreciated, reviled, and despised. They often get themselves into serious difficulty. And they often can create serious difficulty because they're so critical of parts that are trying to do things. When heard, the inner critic can appear to want the best for us. The reason that they're anxious and feel powerless is that, and lonely is because they're isolated, is that they're trying to get us to do something that they think is going to keep us from feeling more pain and is going to make us successful. But in their internal process, they're so critical that they're actually very destructive. And it's on this particular one, this voice that gets created within us that is self-critical and is always putting us down and doubting us and criticizing what we're doing or trying to do or thinking, even thinking of doing. That is a part that we acquired in childhood. We actually acquire all of these parts in childhood, but this one in particular, we usually have a parent who tends to be very critical, and we internalize that. Then we don't need our parent anymore because we do it to ourselves. And it can be very, very self-destructive. And that's why it's very important not to criticize, belittle children and make fun of them for being small and, not knowing much, whatever. Okay, moving on. The next part is despair, living in a pit with no way out. And that can be a very familiar state. It's like we live in a state of despair. We live down in a pit. This is a very common feeling. Obviously, a state of despair is a depressed state. Ann Weiser Cannell and Barbara Gavin do not use the psychological terminology, and it's easy to understand why. But this is why this is what psychologists call endogenous depression, meaning a depression that's just part of you. And psychologists don't ask the questions usually about what was it in your experience as a child that made you feel like you live in a pit. like you're trapped and can't get out. No matter what you do, you always fall back into that pit. And that's because we usually don't know what that is. We don't remember the voices telling us, the parental voices typically. Could be other people in addition, but almost always it's at least one of the parents. And they may feel that same way about themselves. And so they project that onto their child. They don't mean to do it usually, but they do. And it can be very, very painful. And then finally, the sixth, last one is longing, desperately seeking love. Other parts will judge, shame, and reject the desperately longing part. But if we're longing for love, or longing for success, or longing for happiness, that desperation often brings on judgment from others, and usually there's a part inside that is judging. And so when we're looking at ourselves and we're saying, "Oh, what is this tangle I have?" and we say, "Well, there's a part of you that just there's no hope for you finding love," and you always have to say, "Says who?" Says who? And you have to look at that part. Who's telling you that? Who's sending you those messages? Longing is often hard to hide and almost always causes seeking behavior. That is, we don't have control over it. It's going to show up. We're going to do things or say things that make us, that reveal our desperate nature, and that may get us negative feedback, negative, criticism from other people, and that just makes it all the worse. Because then that gives rise to that part that says, see, I told you so. If you try to fulfill that need, you're going to get shot down. You're doomed. Doom comes up in several of these categories of tangles from McGavin and Cornell. There's this sense of doom. You can't get out of it. It's like being down in the pit. You're not going to be able to get out of it. So that's a brief overview of the 6 ways in which tangles show up from McGavin and Cornell. I wanted to spend a minute on the archetypes that Carolyn Mace describes. I'm just editing it here as I go. Um, she describes 4 basic archetypes: child, a victim, a prostitute, and a saboteur. Now, these tend to be set up in a way that makes them sound negative, but they all have their dark side and their bright side. Um, so the bright side of a child is, carefree, happy-go-lucky, um, always inquisitive, exploring, creating, playing, having a good time. The dark side is being dependent, needy, immature, um, insecure, and so there's a dark side to the child that brings into conflict then the dependency versus the sense of responsibility, the inquisitiveness and the playfulness against the anxiety and self criticism and self doubt. Um, so that's the archetype of the child, and so those kind of factors show up in the tangles. So sometimes in a tangle, there's a part that's very childlike in the negative sense, very dependent, very needy, very fearful, very hesitant, always looking for somebody else to tell them what to do. The second one is, well, a second one is a victim. Um, the victim is the one who takes or is taken advantage of, blames, self-pity, powerlessness. Um, the victim is hurt. The victim is one that says, "Oh, poor me," um, and "Why me?" and "Why me again? Why is it always me? Why does this keep happening? And the tangle is they don't know why. So the tangle is built of components that result in a paralysis, as we described before. Third archetype is the prostitute, one who sells out, who serves others at one's own expense. And there's usually a set of voices in there. One set says, "Oh, you've got to do this," or they will ignore you, they won't care for you, they won't love you, and then another part experiences that they get, criticized and used and abused, and often very seriously hurt. So the prostitute is a powerful negative one. And then there's the saboteur, the one that blocks, undermines, or doubts you. It's a voice within that goes like, "You can't do that. You're not good enough. You don't know enough. You're not trained enough. Um, you're not smart enough. Dummy." Calls you names. So the saboteur is a very common part that shows up in tangles. And then there's the ones. This is a group of them: the god or goddess, the priest or priestess, the sage, the teacher, conscience. It tells us, this part of us tells us how to be. It's our moral guide that believes that it has to keep us civilized. It's the part that makes us a right sort of person, a good person. And so there's this part that's like our goddess. Now, there may be another part that says, "Look at you. You're hardly a god or a goddess. You're hardly a priest or a priestess. You're no sage. You're no teacher." You know, and thank God you have a conscience, because otherwise you'd be doing all these horrible things. So that kind of set of voices can show up in tangles. And then from Ayurveda has three governing principles, three operating principles. They're called dosha. And the dosha are called vata, pitta, and kapha. Vata is about movement, transportation, and communication. Movement, transportation, communication. Pitta is about heat, energy, metabolism, and transformation, change. Pitta is a powerful transformative agent. And Kapha is about strength, solidity, stability. Now, it is said that these dosha get out of balance, and when they're out of balance, they cause problems. Vata, in particular, causes worry, anxiety, doubt, typically excessive movement, although it can also be diminished movement, and a tendency to talk a lot, but not necessarily to communicate very well. Um, in contrast, Pitta tends to be very focused in their speech and tends to be angry. They're about metabolism, and they can be very powerful physical people. Um, and they're all about change, all about transformation. So they show up in the tangles where there's issues about moving on from one thing to another. And then kapha, which is normally strength, solidity, stability, it can wind up being very dull, heavy, immobile, immovable, immobile, um, and lethargic. So that's another thing that can show up within our tangles. So these the archetypes and the dosha are just additional ways that we can see the energy that's involved in tangles operating within us. And so it gives us a little bit more analysis, a little bit better way of looking at it. So when we look at our body and we say, "Oh, I'm having an issue with," I'll pick one that's relevant with urination. Well, if it's urinary frequency, excuse me one second, I'm going to sneeze. Okay, don't know where that came from, but that is a vata function. So there's a classic example for you. I did shut off the sound for you because I was afraid to be very loud, um, and sort of unpleasant. So um, we use the dosha, we use the archetypes as ways of getting a deeper insight into the components of a tangle so that we know how to deal with that. So that's basically um, what I wanted to talk about. And so I'm going to look here in the chat, see if there's anything. I'm going to give you a moment to finish up your homework if you haven't done it. Question, can we include a national emergency? Um, that sounds very impersonal. It's like a collective tangle rather than one's own tangle, but you could talk about what about there being an emergency that is distressing to you, that is blocking you, that is holding you in place, that makes you stuck. What about that makes you stuck? That you can write about. So yeah, I talked about urinary frequency and urgency. Um, you can have the opposite. You can have urinary hesitancy and inability to go. And that can be a Vata thing. It can also be a Kapha thing. If it's prostate issues, that's usually a Kapha thing. The prostate gets big, heavy, not working function or functioning properly. So that's more of a Kapha thing. But you've also got a Vata issue there. So you've got both things going on. And of course, if there's an element of prostatitis, that's a Pitta thing. So, but that's a physiological problem. The question is, what's the energy tangle that's behind that? And that tangle may be, described well by the doshas. Um, but we also need to look and say, what is it? What voices are there within me? What parts within me that are causing that problem? That may be a little bit difficult one to work out in the group clearing session. Okay, I think that has us well set up for the group clearing session. So I'm going to stop the recording here and just mention that the webinar in March will be on the same date, the 11th of March. That's because February has 28 days, comes out an even number in terms of weeks. And that one is probably going to be on resolving one's addiction to love. So we're going to look at that one particular thing about longing, that particular um, attachment, and we'll look in terms of addiction to love. And I'm hoping that'll be very interesting. I think it will be. That's the plan anyway for now. Okay, folks, with that, I will stop the recording and we'll move on to the group clearing session.